welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm going to start by saying that I'm sorry for the screw up last time. That was another probably mistake on my part for planning it on a Memorial Day weekend. It was probably not a good time to have it being done. So to just postpone and move it to this date. So hopefully I can do it justice with everybody. And I also want to run an idea past everyone, kind of get your thoughts on it, since you guys have been really active in being part of this whole thing. And that is, I get a lot of questions on by email, Instagram, and on the forum even, and I often end up spending a fair bit of time answering those things to one person. And I've been thinking about the idea of doing sort of a Q&A, question and answers, let people submit questions. And then I would probably make something like this, like a little YouTube video or record a little podcast type thing where I would be able to elaborate and answer. It's easier for me to talk than it is to type. And I just wanted to run that by, since you guys are the active participants in all this, you can just let me know, in the chat or wherever. And, if that sounds like a good idea to you, I'd love to hear it. It seems like it would be something that people would be interested in. I'm just not sure. And maybe I'm deluding myself, but the only restriction I think I would want to put on it would be that would prefer to have, questions that are applicable, kind of across to a lot of people, not some very specific thing like, what do I do in the last, 2 weeks, or I missed 2 weeks of training and I'm trying to get ready for a race, and what should I do? That kind of thing, something that pertains really particularly to you then, or to a single person, would probably be best done, in private or on a phone consultation, or I'm happy to answer emails like that as well. But anyway, let me know if that seems like a worthwhile idea to you folks. Okay, so thank you. I see already there's some folks that like that idea. Yeah, it'd be kind of like the Tuesday tips, but probably a longer format. The Tuesday tips thing I'm doing, keeping those fairly short so they can go on Instagram, trying to keep them, 2 or 3 minutes. But these would be more in depth, kind of like what we're doing now, but directed specifically at people's questions that they have, rather than, following the book. We would be dealing with issues that folks have come up with. So but it is that same idea. I'm really just trying to spread the information around to as many folks as I can. So, all right, well, let's roll right into this thing then. I assume everybody can see my screen there. And so this is where it starts to things get a little tricky. And I'm trying to be a little clever and cute here. I made this little slide. So this is where, reality really rears its ugly head, and all the great theories that we've been talking about and those principles, while they're true, this is when, coaching and training becomes much more art than it is science. And so I feel pretty good and confident that people have absorbed the theoretical background of what we've been talking about, pretty solid on, the training methodologies, the physiology, recovery, monitoring your training, those kinds of things, because those principles underlie, everything you're going to need to know going forward. But now we're going to try to figure out, how do we make this stuff fit into our lives and our training. I don't know if any of you are historians, and I'm sure I'm going to get this quote wrong, but I remember reading once that very famous German, 18th century German General von Clausewitz, who wrote what the heck did he write that book? It was a book about war. But anyway, one of the things he said in it was that you can do all the planning you want to do beforehand, but as soon as you meet the enemy, all the plans go out the window. And it's kind of like that with us. I mean, you have to have an understanding of these theories, but you have to also understand that life is messy and things are going to be unexpected. And as you probably have understood from a lot of the talking I've done, I mean, I'm big on this idea of theories and these models, but both of those things are overly simplistic compared to, you know, the reality of the world. Let me just silence my phone here. It's blowing up with Jack Kunzel email or text about his trip on Denali right now. Lots of people. But anyway, so this Moise was the person who showed up last week, last time. So thanks for showing up, Moise. Thanks for coming back. But anyway, going back, repeating myself, hopefully not too much, but we very purposefully try to make these models and theories simple so that we can grasp them. But unfortunately, we're not simple. Life's not simple, not straightforward. Things change and it gets tough. So this is what we're going to be talking a little bit about today and going forward. So today we're not going to get into the nitty gritties of how to make your own training plan. We're going to do one more chapter after this on strength, and then I think that's when we dive into the actual, like, how to lay out training plans. Oh, and I think I forgot one other thing. With regards to this, these sessions, I've been, in some cases, and probably you've noticed this, I've been feeling quite rushed to get through all the material in a timely manner in roughly an hour. And in some cases, I felt like I've had to, move too quickly through some of it. So what I'm also going to propose to everyone who's here, and hopefully people are okay with this too, is that we proceed at a rate that allows us to cover the material in a reasonable, in depth, rather than skimming it. And if that means it takes us, 2 sessions or 1.5 sessions to get through one of these sections or one of these chapters, in my feeling is that so be it, and that's what we should have. So you can also chime in on the chat on that if you're feeling like that's that's going to draw this out too long, or if you're okay with that. I mean, I'm willing to go down, to do this as long as people are interested. So let's take a next, we're going to a little review, because I think this particular stuff you can never understand this too well. And so I'm going to talk you through this again. I know you've seen these graphs before, and we've talked about zones and how this stuff works, but I want to run through it again and make a couple of observations, just so we're all keeping this particular stuff in the back of our mind when we're talking about training. And this is, talking about endurance training. And so this is it's actually not true. I mean, I just made this up, but this is what a lactate curve test would look like for an aerobically deficient person. The lactate levels are over on the left, vertical scale, and I've just arbitrarily put some running paces on the horizontal scale. So obviously, as running pace increases, we're going to see lactates go up for every athlete. But in this case, the big distinction we see here between somebody who's not as well adapted aerobically and someone who you'll see in the next slide, is this big spread between that blue arrow and the red arrow. So this person being aerobically deficient, they can only manage a 12-minute mile at their threshold. And at their anaerobic threshold, they can manage an 8-minute mile pace. And so that's just, we've already talked about how to determine these zones, so I'm not going to go into how to do an anaerobic and aerobic threshold test again. But I think it's important to understand what's going on physiologically here, because this really helps you understand why we train in these different zones. So down in the aerobic zone, well, let me just move on to a more interesting looking athlete here. So this is a well-trained, aerobically well-adapted athlete, well-trained. And what you see now, obviously this person's aerobic threshold is clear up at a 7-minute mile pace, whereas the other person's was a 12-minute mile pace. And the anaerobic threshold here being at around a 6-minute mile pace. So this makes their zone 3 quite small. This is a really well-adapted person aerobically. Now, what's going on here in zone 1 and 2 is that the removal rate of lactate can exceed it's. You've got the capacity to remove lactate basically as fast as it's being produced, and that's why the blue line that represents the blood lactate concentration stays essentially flat until it begins to climb out here as we get passing through the aerobic threshold zone. It starts to climb, and at that point, now at the actual red line, that's when lactate production equals lactate removal. And zone 3 is when you move beyond, the aerobic threshold is this metabolic state at which the more than 50% of the energy production is coming from carbohydrates. Below that, it's primarily fat production. But then when you get into this zone 3, where you've still got the capacity to remove the lactate as fast as it's being produced until you get to this red line. And that's why I've made it red. And once you pass over that red line and you get into the high intensity zone, and we've all felt that most of us can sense this moment when we pass through that red arrow, we can sense that we've all been there. We know what that feels like, because when you get over past it, now the lactate production rate exceeds your body's ability to remove it. And as you can see here from the blue line, lactate begins to accumulate very fast. And we're kind of running on borrowed time here, because as lactate accumulates, we're going to eventually be forced to slow down. Now, if you just stayed in this zone where my cursor is, you could remain there for quite some time, because lactate levels, are not that much higher than they are right down here. But when you get up into this range, which in this case for this person would probably be a 5-minute mile pace, then that person's not going to be able to stay at that pace for very long, because lactate will begin to accumulate to the point where it'll have to slow down. So we just wanted to make sure everybody understood the physiological, what was going on physiologically in these different zones. And the difference between zone 1 and 2 is, as you can see, there's no real threshold here. There's no real clear defining physiological event that occurs here to make this distinction. So most people, myself included, would just call the top of zone 1 about 10% below wherever we found the zone 2 to be. And by the way, this horizontal scale is, it's a measure of intensity. It could be heart rate. In this case, I've just chosen running pace, but it's just, heart rate going to the right or intensity going to the right, and lactate over here on the vertical scale. I just don't have the numbers in there now. Now, moving on to testing, talking about, we were just looking at this is a very traditional lactate test. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to look through that. I put recently quite an extensive article on proper methodologies for lactate testing I think it's the first article you'll come to when you go to the knowledge page. So if you're wanting to do a deep dive into blood lactate use, both measurement and testing, and also how to control your training with it, there's a lot of information there. I'm not going to go into that kind of detail here tonight. So with regards to these tests, these are the kind of tests you will hear the names of, and perhaps maybe you've even had some of these tests done. So the most common test you'll hear talked about, and I'll explain why it's so common, is the max VO2 test. And that test is, in many lay person's mind, is considered the gold standard for endurance, that a person with a higher max VO2 is going to have more endurance than a person with a lower max VO2. But there's a lot of nuance to that statement. So it isn't a gold standard for endurance. It is one of the markers for endurance. The reason it's used so much is it's relatively easy to measure. The concept was invented by this guy, Archibald Hill, a British physiologist, in the early 20th century. I think maybe before or during World War I, is a long time ago, over 100 years ago. He was the first one to understand that oxygen, the supply of oxygen to the muscles was what was limiting a person's ability to continue exercise. And it's the reason it's, again, so popular is that if you have a proper lab and you're going to be testing people, this is something that's relatively easy to test. And so you can test people before a training protocol. And then, let's say you get a bunch of college students and you run them through this test and you measure their max VO2 today, and then you have them do a particular type of training for 6 weeks. And then you want to see what the effect that had. You measure their max VO2. Again, at the other end. Now, the problem with a lot of these studies, and we'll get onto studies a little bit later, is that most of these studies, they use just your standard college kid. They're just somebody that they can drag in off the street. They're not using well-trained endurance athletes. They're certainly not using elite endurance athletes, because those people aren't going to sit still. They're not going to be part of a test. It'll screw up. They don't want to be doing something that messes their training. So that's one of the problems with max VO2 testing, is that if you take a relatively untrained person and you put them through 6 weeks of training that they've never done before, well, then heck yeah, their max VO2 is going to go up. And so people have taken that out of context and said, oh, look at this particular type of training. And there's been hundreds and hundreds of these types of tests, or these studies done, and they go, look at this type of training produced these 30% improvement in these people's max VO2. Well, they had, the max VO2 of your grandmother when they started. And so they, it's pretty easy to improve that young, healthy person. So there's a lot of things to have caveats that go along with this max VO2 test. Now, it's being sold to the public, again, because a lot of the public thinks that this is the gold standard. So health clubs and a lot of testing facilities offer a max VO2 test. I'm personally not interested in them. I don't recommend them, and you certainly should not go do one in order to establish your training zones. And I'll explain why in a second. But the reason they become so popular in these labs is that it used to be that the device that they use for testing is called a MET cart, a metabolic cart. And they used to be like $100,000. And this was years and years ago. So $100,000 was a lot of money, and only a university or pretty serious testing facility would invest that. Now the price of Met carts have, they've come down to being really small. There are some that are only as big as a little ventilator you wear on your face. All of the electronics and everything else is in this little face mask. And they're about, I think, between $5,000 and $10,000. So the prices dropped dramatically, which meant that your standard health club could buy one of these things and then start offering these tests to its members. And if you go to some of the websites of some of these companies that are making these newer, cheaper, they're still good, but they're much cheaper Met carts, and they're not a cart anymore. They used to be a cart because they had to be rolled around. They were so big, but they're making these devices. If you go to their websites, you'll see they are marketing them very heavily to health clubs and as a profit center. And the way they do this is they package the software for the test. They give whoever the person that's going to be running the test, a few hours of training, and then they turn them loose. And they're charging $200, $300 for these tests. So you've got a person you're paying $12 an hour. You're charging $300 for a test that takes an hour. It's a highly profitable business. And so that's why the proliferation, and I'm sure if you go to health clubs, you've probably seen them offering these tests. My experience with them is usually the technician, the person that they're training doesn't know much about what they're doing. And the protocols are canned. They are set up to train to test max VO2 pretty much only. Now, the max VO2 test, you have to go to exhaustion. Now, if you're an elite athlete, you could get a lot of information out of a max VO2 test, because you could use 3-minute stages. So every 3 minutes, you would increase the speed of the treadmill or the incline of the treadmill or something to increase the intensity. And you could run this, an elite athlete could stay on there for 30 to 40 minutes probably. And you'd be able to take them from very low intensity and see their response to their aerobic response at zones 1 and 2 and 3. And then you'd be able to see their max VO2 out there at the end of the test. The problem with they can't do that with most amateurs, and especially poorly trained ones. They will become exhausted within about 10 or 12 minutes. And so what the standard test protocol for max VO2 is to ramp up. And in some cases, I've seen the stages be as short as 15 seconds. So they're ramping the athlete up to their max VO2 so that in 8 or 12 minutes or something like that, they can actually see, what's the max VO2 of this person. Because if you fatigue the athlete before you get to that max VO2, they're not going to be able to produce their max VO2. Their legs are going to be tired. They won't be able to run as fast. So that's one of the reasons I think the standard max VO2 test doesn't work well, the kind of thing that's offered in health clubs. Now, the one I think is most beneficial, not most, it is beneficial for curious endurance athletes, is the metabolic efficiency test, the MET, which is often called the metabolic flexibility. It's like, how good are your muscles at using both carbohydrates and fat for fuel? And this test doesn't go to max. Doesn't need to. It basically starts at a low intensity and uses 3 or 4 minute stages of gradually increasing intensity. And you're breathing into one of those devices, just like I was talking to, a Met cart. And it's measuring the amount of expired CO2. And from that, there's a ratio they can use called the respiratory exchange ratio that can tell the physiologist or the technician, who's ever doing this, what's the percentage of fat versus carbohydrates that you're using right now. And that can be quite helpful for people who are getting started and want to know, like, okay, how good am I at burning fat at low intensities? And how good am I at burning carbohydrates at high intensities? So the problem with this test is there aren't that many places that do it. There's a handful that I know of. There's one or two in Denver. There's one in Seattle, and there's that guy that now that I'm blanking on his name. Oh, I'm embarrassed. The guy who runs the lab at UC Davis. I've done some podcasts with him and trying to get him back on. Actually, he's not going to come back on after he realizes I'm blanking on his name. But anyway, UC Davis is another. If you live in the Bay Area, that's a great place to go to get one of these kind of tests. But anyway, that's a pretty useful test for an endurance athlete. Won't tell you your max VO2 because they don't take you. I mean, it takes a long time. You're going to be on that treadmill for 30, 45 minutes, and they don't run you all the way to exhaustion. Now, the other tests we should talk about, I think they're useful and why we want to use them. You see at that top, I've got this question: what do you hope to learn from taking these tests? And I often get people say, I'm going to go get a max VO2 test at my local health club. And my first question is, why are you doing that? Not necessarily that you don't want to know, but what do you hope to gain from that? What's going to come out of it? How's that going to affect your training? So I think it's important to understand what you're looking for here. So I think that the two tests that are the most important are the aerobic threshold and anaerobic threshold. Every endurance athlete should have those because that's how you personalize your training. It's what, as you can imagine, the training for this person is going to look entirely different than the training for that person. I mean, they have completely different responses to exercise. Totally, this person's got an aerobic system that won't quit, and this person needs an aerobic system. So they need very different kinds of training. And if you don't know this about them, this is why, just throwing somebody into a random training plan is not a good idea. And I don't know if any of you ever bought one of our training plans, either here or at Uphill Athlete, the plans that I wrote. The first thing you do is establish the aerobic threshold. That's the first day one. That's your job, is to establish that. So I think it's important to understand why you're doing the aerobic threshold and the anaerobic threshold. Now, these are ways you can do it. You can do the Maffetone method, the maximum aerobic function method, which is a formulaic approach, 180 minus your age with a little fudge factor in there. I've written about it. I think it's in the books. I'm less inclined to use that. If we use it as a default, like if a person comes to us and they keep failing with a heart rate drift test for some reason, some technology or whatever, they can't follow instructions, which is surprisingly common, then we'll defaulting and say, okay, we're just going to use 180 minus your age. At least that's my experience. That's always been very conservative. So if everything fails, or if you've got a friend who doesn't who doesn't want to do any kind of testing, they don't have a Training Peaks account, just take 180 minus their age, and you're going to be in the ballpark and probably a little low, which is still fine for those folks. Now, you can use a ventilation markers. We've talked about this, conversational pace, nose breathing. It will usually be the upper limit of the aerobic threshold will be the upper limit of nose breathing and conversation, where you can speak in full sentences. It's, little, it should be a perfect real-time test because ventilation is, you're blowing off carbon dioxide. This is what you're doing when you exhale. Ventilation is more about getting rid of the carbon dioxide than it is getting the oxygen in. And so this should be a great marker, but I think most of us are not sensitive enough to our ventilation. And by ventilation, I mean the rate and depth of breathing. And I think most of us are not sensitive enough to really accurately depend on this. But it is a way you can do it. You can measure blood lactate, and it requires a lactate monitor. And most amateurs are not going to screw around with this, but I use them with elite athletes frequently, and I think they do have a place. But there's in that article I even talk about, it's not an easy thing to do to test lactates. It's not just randomly going and poking a hole in your finger and squeezing some blood out. You need to have a system, and you need to know how to get the blood and all that stuff. Then finally, there's the gas exchange, which is that kind of test I was talking about, where they use a MET cart for like the max VO2 or the metabolic flexibility or efficiency test. But we have defaulted in almost every case, even with, I coached the woman who won the Western States last year, and we used the heart rate drift test with her. I still do it with professional athletes, because I have found it to be several benefits of, I think, using the heart rate drift test, even though it does require you to have a Training Peaks account. And you might notice there's nothing in here about the heart rate drift test. And that was a conscious decision that I made. I didn't want to endorse Training Peaks. I think Training Peaks is a great program, and they're wonderful, but they don't do anything for me or us. I was an uphill athlete, and we pay a lot of money every year to use Training Peaks. And so I figured, okay, I'm not going to give them a free endorsement and tell everybody they should. And I didn't want to make people feel as if you don't have a Training Peaks account, you can't do all this stuff. So, but the heart rate drift test is great. And I'm not going to talk about how you do it, because I've written thousands of words on it. Anaerobic threshold or lactate threshold. You can do this with gas exchange, the MET cart. I think that's a really poor way to do it. And I'll explain why in a minute. You can do it with lactate. It's often done with lactate. I think that's a really poor way to do it. I got gas exchange twice. You really should only be in there once. Sorry about that. Or you can use a field test. And this is what we have gravitated to I've used this now for 25 years. And basically, this is a time trial. You are going to, in whatever sport you're training for, or whatever your event is, if it's hiking uphill really fast, it's like you want to train for mountaineering, or if it's running, you're going to do it in a sport-specific time trial. And you're going to just basically go as hard as you can. And we're going to see what your average heart rate is. Now, remember, heart rate is kind of a proxy for intensity. It's sort of a proxy for power or pace. You could do this with, like if you were a road runner, you could do a flat time trial and say, oh, my anaerobic threshold average pace for 30 minutes or 40 minutes or something like that was, a 10-minute mile. Okay, well, now you know your anaerobic threshold. You've actually measured it in the field in a real test. As compared to a gas exchange or a lactate test. And the problem with those is that those are done on a treadmill. Let's say we're using a treadmill because we're mostly going to be running or hiking with a 3-minute stage. So you're going to be transitioning metabolically through this this zone where the anaerobic or lactate threshold occurs. You're only going to be there for 3 minutes. So as you can imagine, you could sustain a much higher intensity for 3 minutes than you can for 30 minutes. And a better definition of the anaerobic threshold is what is your endurance limit? What is the amount of power you can sustain for a long time? And the arbitrary definition in sports science is an hour. Now, that's fine for an elite athlete with a lot of muscular endurance, but most of us will fatigue over the course. After about 30 minutes, we'll begin to fatigue, and then the heart rate or the speed will begin to drop off. We won't be able to maintain that. So I typically use 30 to 40 minutes, unless I'm working with an elite athlete. But this actually tells you, oh, this is the heart rate you can sustain. This is the pace you can sustain. This is the power you can sustain for 30 minutes. That is truly a performance measurement of your limit of your endurance. So I very much prefer to do that test. The other one is this down here, maximum lactate steady state, because remember when we talked about that, this red line represents the maximum intensity you can run or move at, where lactate production equals lactate removal. So this red line, besides being called the anaerobic threshold, I actually think a very clever name, it's rather new in the past decade or so, is maximum lactate steady state, because this is the maximum intensity you can sustain where blood lactate levels will be relatively pretty much constant there. Anything above it, lactate levels will rise dramatically. So anyway, that is a valuable test to do. It's a pain in the ass to do, frankly. And I'd written about how to do it in this article that I just mentioned to you, because I had a lot of questions about lactate lately. So I thought I'd write that article. But so, unless you're really a nerd about this stuff, I mean, it's a cool test, and you will learn a lot when you do it, but it's not easy to perform. So I won't go into it more than that. So how do you get started with all these ideas, with thinking about how you're going to train? Remember, I think it was a couple of months ago now when we did the third session, I said, you need to understand the demands of your event. That's the first thing. What are you training for? I mean, if you're training for a bike race, well, then, the demands are going to be quite different than if you're training for a mountaineering expedition or a running race or whatever. So that's the first thing, is what are the demands of your event? Then you need to identify what are the fundamental qualities that result in the performance you can have in that event. By that, we're mainly talking about aerobic capacity for endurance. We're also talking about, that anaerobic threshold, how much power can you sustain for how long. We're looking at strength, speed, agility, perhaps, depending on what the event is. So you need to look at all those, identify those qualities, and then you need to assess those qualities. Now, there's a very famous cycling coach from the 70s and 80s, I believe, Eddie Borshewitz, an American, was Polish, came over here and coached some of the top Americans. And he had this famous quote was, "Race your strengths, train your weaknesses." And I think that's a really apropos thing. And that's basically what we're saying here. Figure out what you're weakest at, and you need to target that kind of stuff in your training. Now, one thing I can say is there's no such thing as too much aerobic capacity. So even if you've got a decent aerobic capacity, that should still be trained pretty well. But if, let's say, your muscular endurance is low, or your speed or your power is low, those are the things that are going to keep you from being able to perform well. Like if you have low power or low muscular endurance, that's going to negatively impact your endurance performance, because you're not going to be able to sustain a very high output for very long. In other words, your anaerobic threshold is going to be low. You're not going to be able to sustain a 6-minute mile pace. You're going to be at the 10 or 12-minute mile pace. So, even if think, well, I'm not a sprinter, I don't need to be powerful. Well, actually, it's helpful to be powerful as an endurance athlete. So then once you assess and honestly assess those weaknesses, then you got to target those in the base period. And you need to elevate, you need to improve those. Those are the things that are holding you back right now. And then once you get into the specific period, and when you get into the specific period is important, you don't want to go to your first running race or your first mountain climbing expedition with never having done any really hard work. Let's say you're aerobically deficient. And so you realize, like, I got to fix this aerobic deficiency. So all you do is zone 1 and zone 2 training for months at a time. Well, two things are going to happen. One is you're probably going to get weaker, and you're probably going to get slower at high intensity. Your aerobic threshold will move up, and you will get faster at aerobic threshold, which is really important. But if you then go enter a race, you won't have any top end. And so at some point before this major event, a climbing expedition, a climbing trip or run race, it doesn't matter, you need to start putting in some specific training. And what that means is you start making your training look like the event. And so in mountaineering, it would be putting on a heavy pack and hiking fast and as hard as you can uphill to try to build that the kind of the muscular endurance and the speed endurance that you would need in the mountains. Similarly, in a running race, you would shift to more traditional high intensity, like uphill intervals if you're doing a mountain race, something like that. And you need that. And I would say no matter what you've been able to accomplish in your base period in terms of fixing your aerobic deficiency or deficiency in any of these other things, once you get within about 8 weeks of your event, you better start adding specific training, and you need to start adding specific training. And we'll go into much more detail about this when we do get into laying out how to train, write training plans and programs and stuff. But for most people, the biggest thing that's going to hold them back is this aerobic deficiency. And as you all know now, you heard it 1,000 times, there's only one way to fix that. But the beauty of that heart rate drift test here is you can test that sucker anytime you want. You don't need to go back to the lab, spend $150, $300, whatever. You can just, you can do this during your normal training. You don't even have to do a treadmill test, because if you look at your training peaks, you will notice that you will see if you have a premium, no, you don't even need a premium account. But if you look at the data or the analysis for a workout, you'll see that it'll give you an average pace and an average heart rate. And if you see over time, look at that, my average pace is improved a minute per mile, and my average heart rate is for the same heart rate. Well, then the only way that can happen is if your aerobic capacity goes up. So that might be a good time to reassess and say, maybe I need to do another test again, because I've obviously seen some improvement in my aerobic capacity. So that's one of the main reasons that we go for that heart rate drift test. It's very easy to monitor improvement with the athlete over time. And especially if you, let's say, train on the same course a lot, train on the same terrain. So now let's see this one. Okay. People often ask how much is too much, because I've said, not regretfully, but this is again, something with nuance, is that when it comes to aerobic capacity, in terms of training, more is going to produce better results. There is no shortcut. Volume of training is key. It's the reason that elite athletes are, running 100+ miles per week. And, they need that stimulus, and they can handle it. So they don't break down under it, but it gives them a bigger training stimulus. So how do you know? I mean, most of us are not going to be able to do 100 miles of running a week, but how much is enough and how much is too much? So my favorite way of determining this is, can you go out and do tomorrow what you just did today? And then again the next day and the next day and the next day. And if you can't, then it was either too long or too hard. It was exceeding your work capacity for this aerobic based training. And then you need to say, okay, maybe what I thought would be a 2-hour run needs to be a 2-hour hike, or with a little bit of running on the flats, in order to be able to get up and do it again tomorrow, because consistency is key. That's how you're going to build volume, is you're going out and doing a 2-hour aerobic workout, on Monday, and then kind of being trashed till Thursday, and doing it on Thursday, and then being trashed till Sunday. and so you can't do it again, that's going to be, you'd be better off doing a shorter or easier one and trying to hit it every day, in terms of maximizing ideal. I mean, I understand that this is not maybe realistic for many people with real jobs and that sort of thing. I'm talking idealistically here. So this is going to all fit in together is, well, I guess on my third bullet point there, easier and better is better to be training too easy than it is too hard. I'm missing an O there. God, who's my spell checker? Geez, sorry. Anyway, it's because it's easier to ramp up. If you trained, let's say you could go out and do an hour run every single day of the week, and you go, that was pretty easy. I felt fine. Okay, well then maybe next week we do an hour and 15 minutes 4 times and an hour 3 times. And it's much easier to build up from too easy than it is to overstep and go too hard and then blow up. So you're thinking, okay, I'm going to run an hour every day. And then by the time you get to Thursday, you're exhausted. You can't even finish the week. Now what you've done is dug yourself into a deep hole that it's going to take probably a long time to come out of. You've kind of messed up your training a little bit. It's not the end of the world. You can fix this, but I hope you can understand that much better to go too easy and then discover a week later, oh, that was too easy. I think I can do more, than to discover halfway through the week that you went too hard. Now this gets into the next step, gets into that be realistic part. This is something Killian and I talked a lot about when we were writing the book, and also something we've talked about in podcasts and something he really wanted to be cautious about recommending, that people don't try to do what he does. It'd be silly. But it's, and I'm using him here as an extreme example, but it's very, very common to look at the training of an elite athlete and think that's what made them so good, and so I better do that as well, or if I train like that, I will get good as well. But what you don't realize is that kind of famous the iceberg effect, where when you look at the iceberg, you're seeing 10% of the iceberg, the other 90% is hidden below the surface of the water. Well, when you look at Killian or an elite person's training leading into some race for the past 4 months, all you're seeing is that tip of the iceberg sticking out of the water. You're not seeing all the years and years and thousands of hours that have gone into getting them there. And so it's not so much that it's not that the training they're doing is what allowed them to perform so well. It's the training they've done before that allows them to handle this kind of training. I will give you I'm working with a guy named Tom Evans. Some of you might know that name. Tom and I've been training together for a while. He was 3rd at the UTMB. He's just beginning this week has started taper into going into the Western states. But Tom's been doing 150 miles a week with 3 hard sessions. 10 by 1 kilometer at sub 3-minute kilometers, that kind of hard work. Not very many people in the world can handle that kind of training. So if you looked at this snapshot of what Tom's been doing the last 2 or 3 months, and you thought, oh, that's what makes him so good, I'm going to jump in and do that, there is a very good chance you will do a lot of harm to yourself and not see the kind of results that you think, because you don't have the training background to handle that kind of work, that volume and that intensity. So be very careful. I think it's really unfortunate that running magazines and some Runner's World used to be maybe the worst at this kind of thing, is so-and-so did this for the last 6 weeks before their marathon. You too could run your best marathon in 6 weeks, just nutty stuff like that, they're looking at this person that runs a 2:08 marathon and telling you that you should do that training that this person did leading into that marathon. It's kind of almost criminal. And so anyway, just be careful, be realistic, have your expectations in line with your commitment and with your, with your ability. Like if you can't do more than 3 or 4 hours of training in a week, both combination of strength and speed and power and endurance. I mean, if that's your limitation, which is fine, just don't expect to, be the first person across the finish line or the fastest one to the summit. I mean, you just, that's kind of a fantasy that's born in Hollywood of, people who can manage to get by, do that kind of thing. I've never met anybody who has that ability. And so I just think, be realistic. And I think then you're not going to be dissatisfied. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the basic endurance methods. And we're going to get into the zones here, but just kind of superficially, we won't get into the details of the training, like I said, until I think it's probably 2 chapters from now. But warm up and cool down are really important. They do add to the beneficial effect of endurance training, and they fire up the central nervous system. For one thing, you've been in a relatively, most cases, sedentary state. Probably you've driven your car to the trailhead or the gym or something like that. So your parasympathetic, well, maybe if you've been driving your car, your sympathetic nervous system is cranked up. I don't know what your traffic situation is like. But anyway, probably your parasympathetic nervous system, or likely, is dominant. So you're kind of in a rest and digest mode. You need to turn on the sympathetic nervous system, elevate the heart rate, open up the capillaries, and allow the aerobic metabolism to start to come online. So the warm up and the cool down too has a pretty important effect. We're going to talk about cool down in a minute, both of them in a minute. But so don't disregard that. Like, don't drive to the trailhead, jump out of the car, and start your first interval. That's a mistake. Or even start off kind of hard. I think we all have that tendency. I'm sure you've been with friends where you get to the trailhead and everybody's amped up and wanting to go, whether it's the approach to a climb or a run or whatever. And often it's like a race when you leave the parking lot. And that's going to have a negative effect on the whole overall training session, because first of all, it's like you're thrown cold water into your face in terms of trying to get your central nervous system fired up in a matter of a few seconds. The capillaries the way you can tell when well, maybe I'll get to that when I talk about warm-ups, how you can tell when your capillaries have opened. But don't do that. Don't start off too hard. You'll get a lot more benefit if you are gradually warming up into these workouts. And then there's some aerobic benefit, I think, that comes from even very light aerobic work. But the main effect of recovery, I think, is restorative. You should feel better, if not immediately after whatever the recovery session is. Maybe it's going out for an hour walk with your wife or your dog or your mother, doesn't matter. But I mean, something that's really easy for you has a restorative effect. And even if it doesn't make you feel better the moment you stop, almost inevitably, if you've done it properly, within a few hours or by the next day, you're going to go, oh yeah, that I definitely feel better than I did yesterday. So there is some real benefit to recovery. I like to do like an aerobic stimulus to that. There's no reason you shouldn't do something like yoga or foam rolling and stretching. Those are all beneficial too. But I think light aerobic work is one of the best recovery methods, way better than just plopping down on the couch and resting. That tends to make you feel heavy. Your legs will get heavy. It isn't usually the best thing. So then we've got, everybody's pretty familiar with these concepts. Zone 1 and 2, we're going to develop basic aerobic capacity, improve our ability to use fat for fuel. Then we get into zone 3, we're talking endurance training, really. And this is something that I've got a question somebody asked me recently, and that I want to do in one of these Q&As that I was just mentioning, is zone 1 and 2 isn't, for many events, it isn't endurance training, because most endurance events are going to be competed in zone 3. Now, that's not true if you're a mountaineer or running a 100-mile race. You won't be spending very much time in zone 3 in those two. When you're out for, let's say, more than 3 or 4 hours, then your endurance limit will be, well, it really isn't a limit, but you're going to, if you're smart, you're going to stay down in zone 1 and 2 so that you can finish that event. But in most cases, let's say, 50 kilometers and less in running races, where you're on hilly trails or if you're going to do a Jack Kunzel FKT on a mountain somewhere, then your endurance limit is going to be up there at the anaerobic threshold in zone 3. And so for many athletes, zone 3 is actually endurance training, and zone 1 and 2 are the aerobic support for that endurance training. Well, they're the aerobic support for all this other training, maybe not zone 5, but a little bit for zone 5, but they are the zone 1 and 2 are really a support mechanism or a support foundation for all of this other type of training. And I think it's important to understand that, because often people get confused that just because it's aerobic doesn't mean it's really taxing your endurance. So anyway, if that doesn't make sense, feel free to email me. I know it's a little bit of a weird concept. But then when we get up into zone 4, above the anaerobic threshold, we've got everything is in the red zone there. I mean, you've maxed out your glycolytic metabolism, your fat metabolism, your aerobic metabolism is going full speed. And like this is why they call it, this is where max VO2 is developed, is in that zone 4 range. And it's really it'd be like putting the engine of your car on a dynamometer and measuring its maximum power. This is where you will develop your maximum power. Unlike a car engine, we can't make our maximum power for very long. 2 or 3 minutes for most people would be the length of time they could actually sustain maximum power. Now they can stay. I mean, it doesn't mean they can't stay in zone 4 for longer, but they would be in the lower end of zone 4. They could stay in for many minutes at a time. And then when you get into zone 5, we're talking about anaerobic power, anaerobic endurance. I mean, this is maximal work in a very short period of time. So for anaerobic power, we'd be talking about something in the range of 15 seconds or less to develop maximum anaerobic power. Maximum anaerobic endurance, and this is something that's rarely used in the kind of events that most of us are involved in, and that would be 1 or 2 minutes as hard as you can go, where you're literally falling to your knees at the end of that repetition. And you might only do that 2 or 3 times because you're going to be exhausted by it. And I mean, even when I was training cross-country ski race sprinters, whose event is 3 minutes long, we might do 1 or 2 of those workouts in a year. I think and you might remember in the book, Killian mentions that, yeah, he does a little bit of this, maybe 3 or 4 of these workouts in a whole year. So, it's a tiny fraction. I think the anaerobic power workouts are more beneficial than the anaerobic endurance workouts. Now, if you're a sport climber, anaerobic endurance is a pretty key component, being able to climb hard at your limit. And like I said, the aerobic capacity is actually a support for that, because it does help get rid of the lactate that's produced from those very high anaerobic efforts. So let me go back and talk a little bit about warm up. I mentioned about switching over from parasympathetic to sympathetic. Break a sweat and wait until you've actually broken a sweat before you start expecting or pushing too hard on the gas pedal. The reason for that is when you break a sweat, it means the capillaries in your skin have begun to open up, and you're dumping heat out through your skin. And at the same time, you also start dumping water out through your skin to cool yourself off. So my assumption is, and I don't know that I've ever read any proof of this, but it makes sense to me, if the capillaries in the skin have now dilated enough to dump heat, probably the capillaries in my muscles have also had a chance to dilate enough to carry a lot of oxygen. So I'm using the capillaries in the skin or the sweat to kind of as a proxy for hopefully a good warm up for the muscles. And if you're going to do any high intensity, then I really think you doing some limbering, calisthenics, something that kind of starts to increase that sympathetic nervous system impulse. And anybody who's done our hill sprint workouts has known that the warm up is almost as long as the workout. and it involves quite a bit of ramping up in intensity as you get ready for those hill sprints. So the cool down has a really important component too. The main one is to return your body back to its homeostasis. Now, I don't know if anybody has ever worn, like, you go to the trailhead, you do your run, you get in the car, you drive home. If you ever looked at your heart rate while you're driving home, you'll notice that it was probably 10 or 15 beats higher than when you were driving to the trailhead. And that's because your body's trying to restore homeostasis. And it would have been probably a good idea to do a little longer cool down and let your heart rate return back to normal or closer to normal before hopping in the car and driving an hour or something. So the cool down plays that role of kind of bringing your body back down to where it was before you started. And if it's a high intensity workout, it can be good to have this kind of, there can be a lot of psychological stress in high intensity training because there's often expectations. You go into the workout knowing this is going to be hard, looking for performance, and you don't want to, if you don't want to be disappointed, and so there you can put pressure on yourself. So kind of cooling down allows for this psychological down regulation a little bit too. And the higher the intensity of the workout, the longer the warm up and the longer the cool down. So as an example, a cross-country ski sprint, again, a 3-minute event, the warm up for that will be an hour at least. A 50-kilometer running race, the warm up might be 10 or 10 minutes because the intensity is going to be pretty darn low in that. So you just don't need as much of a warm up for it because the difference in intensity between the warm up and the actual race isn't that great. Whereas the intensity in a sprint versus the warm up is massively different. And so during the course of that 1 hour for the sprinter, things are going to get harder and harder and harder, and they will literally go into the starting chute in a lathered up sweat. So I mean, their heart rate's jacked up there because they have to go out of the blocks full on. So think about that the higher the intensity, the longer the warm up and the longer the cool down should be. We're going to do a whole chapter on strength training next time. And I'm really looking forward to that because I think this is something that's really overlooked by endurance athletes. But I'll say that something I've said many times, I'm sure some of you are bored of hearing it, but endurance is a metabolic effect, and strength is a neurologic effect. And speed is dependent on strength and power. So if you're weak or you're not powerful, you're not going to be fast. So if one of the things, I often get people coming to me and say, when I'm out mountain, they're in the mountains, and I'm always the last one into camp, the slowest one. Well, it's because you're probably not very strong. You're not very fast. And even though, you don't think of, hiking up a mountain slowly as speed work, but, if you're limited in your ability to produce power, you're going to be this last one into camp. Doesn't matter how much zone 2 and zone 1 training you do if you're not powerful. I honestly think that power is a lot more important than raw strength for endurance athletes, and actually for most athletes. For 2 reasons. One is speed requires power, which is the rapid application of force or strength. And so doing something like a deadlift, let's say, that takes you 3 seconds to stand up from a deadlift, from starting at the floor and standing into a fully erect position with a heavy barbell, it takes you 3 seconds. I would ask the question of how does that relate to running, where the ground contact time and your ability to produce force on the ground is like a quarter of a second each time your foot hits the ground. Even if you're a slow runner like me, it's going to be a quarter or a third of a second my foot is on the ground. That's 10 times less time than happened in that deadlift. So when I do the deadlift, I'm training my brain to move and training those muscles and those nerves to fire in a very, very different way than, let's say, when I want to hike steeply up a steep hill very fast or run fast. And so I really think the focus for most endurance athletes should be on power. Now, there's a strength component to power, but I think You just don't need to be that strong for these kind of events. I mean, I would be willing to bet you that Killian cannot deadlift more than 1.5 times his body weight. And that's not very strong for a weightlifter type person. That would be nothing. Standard, somebody who spends time in a gym probably can deadlift twice their body weight pretty easily. But most of these events we train for do not require very much strength, but they do require power. And so if you're going to train power, you need to increase the rate at which you can recruit muscle fiber. And that means you have to do it in a very specific movement pattern and in a specific rate. So one of my favorite workouts for this is the hill sprints, and we're going to talk about hill sprints later. I can see I've already exceeded my time and I haven't run through everything yet. But I'll give you a quick rundown or a quick example of this with the hill sprints. So I work, as some of you know, I work with a lot of special operations guys, and those guys typically spend a lot of time in the weight room, and they're really strong, deadlifting 2 or 3 times their body weight. Sometimes it's crazy how much those guys can lift. But in some of their job requirements are they need to be very strong and lift heavy things like your buddy. But what I did with this one guy who had just trained, who went through the Delta Force selection, he didn't do any deadlifting this entire time that he was working with me, getting ready for this selection that he had to go to. We only did hill sprints. And partway through it, he just said, I'm going to go in the weight room and see how much I can deadlift. He could still deadlift the same weight that he had been deadlifting when he was like spending 3 days a week deadlifting in the gym, just from doing those hill sprints. It's the only kind of leg strength he did was hill sprints. So I think there's quite a bit of carryover, and and most of us don't need to be deadlifting twice or more than our body weight, but our ability to move uphill fast or even on the flats fast is going to be come from that power. And so we'll talk a little when we get into the strength training component of the book. We'll talk more about how to develop that power and what you can so you don't need to spend hours and hours in a gym, frankly. A lot of people, especially endurance athletes, don't like gyms. Okay, I think I should probably stop here since I've already run over a little bit. I've got another, oh golly, I got another 15 slides or so. So if it's okay with everyone, I hope it is. I've spent more time. I hope you noticed that. I was trying to spend more time on each slide, talking about some more details, and giving you a little more background information. And we'll just take this up where we left off today in our next meeting, which is going to be July 2nd. I was going to do it the last Sunday of June, but that's the Western States race, and I will be with Tom down in Auburn, California, hopefully at the finish line with him coming across in first place. And so I'll be not available that night. And so I needed to move it. So we'll move it to, I think that's a Tuesday, the 2nd, but I think it's July 2nd. Maybe it's a Thursday. Sorry, let me look at my calendar real quick here. I think it's just remember it's a 2nd. We'll be sending out emails and put it on Instagram. But let me see, there's a couple of people putting stuff in the chat here. Okay, all righty. Well, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate all your attention and your support in doing this. I enjoy it. I hope you do. And we've done in the past. We'll put this up on YouTube. It might sometimes it takes Dave a few days or even longer if he's really busy, or he does all our editing of the podcasts and these things too. But he'll get it up onto YouTube fairly soon. And so anybody, you have any friends you want to share it with, or people who couldn't make this meeting can watch it there. Questions come up, please think about sending them to me. You can send them to either me, Scott at Evoke Endurance. You can send them to Coach at Evoke Endurance. You could put it on either my Instagram, which is Scott, or Coach, whatever I don't even know what my Instagram is. I don't use it very much, but we have an Evoke Instagram, so you could submit those questions there. I think mine's something like Coach_Scott Johnston or something like that, but it's not important. I mean, I'm not a very big deal on Instagram. But anyway, I appreciate it. Thanks a lot, everybody. And we'll see you next month. All right. Bye.